A federal judge yesterday on the 4th of July temporarily blocked the Biden administration agencies and officials from meeting with tech companies, including Twitter, Meta, and Google, about social media censorship. This temporary injunction came in response to lawsuits from attorneys general in Louisiana and Missouri, whose filings described the actions of the Biden administration as, quote, the most egregious violations of the First Amendment in the history of the United States of America, end quote. Joining me now to discuss it is one of the attorney generals who filed that lawsuit, the Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey. General Bailey, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, we're glad to have you. The first thing I want to do is get you to describe one of these. It's provocative, but it's significant. One of the things that you say in your filings is that the Biden administration has been engaged in the most egregious violations of the First Amendment in the history of the United States. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that we've uncovered, and we've only begun to scratch the surface, but already we've uncovered a vast censorship enterprise emanating from the very top levels of the White House, implicating potentially the president himself and expanding over a spectrum of unelected federal bureaucratic agencies. It's a relationship of both coercion and collusion with woke big tech social media corporations to silence Americans' free speech in violation of the First Amendment. And lo and behold, the only speech they're silencing is conservative voices. And so this is scary stuff. The court has just described it as a dystopian scenario, Orwellian in nature. In court, our motion back on May 26th, the judge asked the attorneys from the Department of Justice if they had read George Orwell's novel 1984 and were familiar with it, because in his ruling that was handed down yesterday, he described the censorship effort is almost like the Ministry of Truth from Oceania in the George Orwell novel. And so this is scary stuff. Again, we're fighting to protect Americans and Missourians' First Amendment right to free speech. There's a reason that the right to free speech, free religious exercise, and freedom of the press are all in the very First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And it's because the founders understood that the rights of conscience were given to us by God, not man, and that the structure of the Constitution was intended to protect those rights that we cherish from the government. And in this instance, the government is the most blatant violator of those rights by censoring speech on big tech social media platforms. So we're going to continue to fight, let freedom ring. And what a great way to celebrate the 4th than by obtaining this preliminary injunction to protect our First Amendment rights under the Constitution.
Now, you referred to there, one of the claims the judge made in his statement was that the government would claim to be interested in stopping misinformation, but what the judge decided is that they were really primarily interested in stopping political speech that they didn't like. Do you have any examples of how that was working?
Yeah, look, this was never about truth. It was always about power. And so what we see is that basically if the federal government and if Joe Biden or Dr. Anthony Fauci or anyone else that's involved in the censorship enterprise decides that a speaker is saying something that is dis, or malinformation, that the federal government then has the authority to squelch that speech, silence that speech, stifle that speech on big tech social media platforms. And that, again, this is a scary world because the people should determine what is and is not true based on free, fair, and open debate, not government officials deciding what we should and shouldn't be talking about. One of the best examples I have is in a series of emails between March and May of 2021 between White House Digital Strategy Director Rob Flaherty and cronies in big tech social media corporations, where he specifically targets, the White House targets anyone whose speech involves vaccine hesitancy or questioning whether masks are effective in combating the pandemic. He specifically targets a Tommy Lahren video, a Tucker Carlson video, and demands those be taken down. And big tech social media comes back and says, well, hold on a second. None of this speech violates our terms and conditions. The White House says, we don't care. Go further than your terms and conditions or your user agreements, and specifically says that the request is coming from the highest, and he emphasizes very highest levels of the White House, thereby implicating the president himself.
And General Bailey, we do now have the benefit of hindsight, and it turns out that much of the information that the federal government was telling people to amplify was false, and much of the information that they were telling social media companies to suppress, turns out that was true. Was that relevant to the judge's decision in this case?
Well, I think that it could be, but at the end of the day, I mean, certainly it's relevant to your viewers and relevant to the rest of us who pay attention to this. But as far as the law is concerned, the government has no business telling people what they should and shouldn't talk about. It's up to us to determine what is or isn't true. The remedy for disfavored speech in this nation has always been counter speech, not government censorship. So if President Biden doesn't like what we're saying on big tech social media platforms, he can take to those platforms and counter our speech with his own speech. But what he can't do is silence us and stifle our voices. It not only hurts the speaker, but it hurts the potential listeners.
Right. So I want to get into this ruling from the judge. It was an injunction, temporary injunction. What exactly is the implication of this ruling for now?
Well, we're starting to erect a wall of separation between tech and state to protect our First Amendment right to free speech. The first brick was laid yesterday. Again, we've only begun to scratch the surface to uncover this vast censorship enterprise in the federal government operated from the White House. We're going to continue to leave no stone unturned as we root out the vast censorship enterprise. We're moving from preliminary stages where we've obtained a preliminary injunction into the merits discovery. We're going to do additional depositions, receive additional documents, and continue to monitor the situation, drive forward to make sure we put a stop to it. What we know is that the censorship started with speech related to COVID and the Hunter Biden laptop story, but we have every reason to believe that that censorship enterprise is now mushroomed and expanded and is covering other topics that the government disagrees with. So, for instance, they can shut down speech related to questioning transgender issues, questioning global warming, or abortion. And so, if we've got to keep fighting to protect our constitutional rights, and what we can't have is a public marketplace of ideas inhibited by the federal government.
Now, General Bailey, what is your response to the idea? And we hear this argument a lot that, well, the social media is a wild, wild west. There's no rules and regulations. There's all sorts of lies being spread. And unless the federal government is there to protect us from misinformation, it will run rampant and we will all be deceived and our democracy will fall apart. What's your response to that?
Well, I think that's exactly the kind of Orwellian nanny state that the judge is concerned about and is warning us against. I mean, again, the whole idea of the First Amendment is to invite dissent and invite discussion so that the people can determine what they do and don't believe based on free, fair, and open debate. It's not for government officials to determine what we should and shouldn't believe. We get to make those decisions for ourselves. And that's why we have the Constitution, to protect us from government indoctrination and government control of both our thoughts, our speech, and what we're hearing.
Now, you've done a lot of research into this relationship between the federal government and social media companies. Based on your research, have you found that social media companies are generally hesitant to cooperate with requests from the federal government, or are they excited to do so?
No, I think they're more than willing to go in lockstep with the Biden administration on this issue. I mean, look, think of it this way. If you were talking on a cell phone and you started talking about things a cell phone company didn't like and the cell phone muted you, that would be censorship at the big tech social media level. But what I'm talking about is way worse because the censorship's occurring at the behest of the federal government. But we know that when Joe Biden threatened from the campaign trail and then from the White House podium to repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, if big tech social media didn't enhance and more aggressively censor Americans' free speech, they were more than happy to do so. Look, it's not a coincidence that the only speech censored are conservative voices. It's because they want to put their thumb on the scale ideologically. But that's exactly the kind of core political speech that the First Amendment was intended to protect.
Have you gotten any response from the White House yet?
Well, I think that they're evaluating the situation. I'm sure they're going to continue to fight. We also know that they've likely transferred a lot of the authority over the censorship enterprise out of the federal government into a quasi-public entity known as the Election Integrity Program. And we know that because individuals who worked at the nerve center of the federal censorship program in the government then moved to the EIP. And so we have every reason to believe that it's growing, that they're transferring it out of the federal government and still controlling it through a third party, which is also illegal. The government can't do indirectly what it would be prohibited from doing directly, but that's almost a sign of consciousness of guilt that they knew they were running up against the First Amendment and needed to avoid that kind of controversy. But we've got them on the hook now. We're going to continue to push the case forward and continue to unravel this and unwind it and hold wrongdoers accountable.
General Bailey, is it your position that social media companies should allow absolutely anything that someone wants to say on their platform, or is it merely that the federal government shouldn't be involved in that decision?
The federal government shouldn't be telling us what we should and shouldn't say. That's the problem here. This is about the federal government censoring Americans' free speech on big tech social media platforms. I think consumers have a right to know what isn't being censored at the in the free and open marketplace of ideas. It should be uninhibited from government intrusion.
Yeah. Now we've got about a minute left. Tell us what the future holds for this case. We know this is a temporary injunction. What does that mean for your likelihood to succeed in the future?
Well, the judge has said that based on the substantial evidence put forward, he believes we're likely to succeed on the merits in establishing a First Amendment violation. We know that on May 26th, when the Department of Justice showed up to court to argue in favor of a motion to dismiss and against our motion for preliminary injunction, the Department of Justice wouldn't commit to protecting the First Amendment going forward. When the court asked them, would it be a violation of the First Amendment for the federal government to silence any American citizen who questioned election integrity, they said, well, it depends. This is an unrepentant Department of Justice who's more than willing to violate the First Amendment rather than protect our First Amendment rights. And that's why it's important to drive this lawsuit forward, continue to root out this vast censorship enterprise, and restore the First Amendment right to free speech for all Americans.
Now, the law doesn't care about public opinion, but do you have a sense about how Americans feel about this issue in about 30 seconds?
Well, I think Americans love our right to free speech. We love free, fair, and open debate. We love being able to see and hear what we please, absent government censorship. That's been a founding principle. Certainly the founders understood that right comes from God, not man. And again, we want to be protected from the government intrusion into that marketplace of ideas. We want the dissent and the discussion. And I think Americans approve of the Constitution and our constitutional rights.
I think you're right about that. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, thank you for being with us, and thank you for your advocacy on behalf of free speech for all of us. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me on.